Welcome to the Crypto Teacher. And guys, I come back with that second video. The truth is stranger than fiction. Of course, the Titanic. And basically we had John Jacob Astor, one of the wealthiest men at the time, was fighting the Federal Reserve. Just happened to be on the actual boat. And the love story that comes on the Titanic is basically his wife was actually pregnant and she wanted to, of course, go on the Titanic to take the trip. But the fact is that JP Morgan was the owner of the actual Titanic, and he was actually supposed to be on the ship at the time of the sailing. But of course he calls out and it sinks and four of the wealthiest men passed away. JP Morgan, actually Nikola Tesla went to JP Morgan because he wanted to basically fund free energy. So the fact is that basically JP Morgan would not fund it because of course they want to monopolize it. That was their whole thing, monopolize and we take over the world. Nikola Tesla then went to Jacob Astor, John Jacob Astor, and advised him that, hey, can you help me out? And of course he was like, yes. And the same way where he was fighting the Federal Reserve from becoming an entity where it is now. So basically, if these guys wouldn't have passed away on this ship, we would not be in the predicament that we're in now. So it's definitely a wild, crazy story. But y'all enjoy the video.
When an iceberg tore a 350-foot gash in the hull of the Titanic, she went down in less than 3 hours. But was there more to the disaster than meets the eye?
There's something about the story that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever.
Was it an accident, or was it a crime?
They were businessmen, and they would make money by hook or by crook.
Is the ship at the bottom of the Atlantic really the Titanic? A dying seaman had told an apparently far-fetched story that the Titanic had been swapped with her damaged sister ship, the Olympic. But the Olympic had been damaged in a collision the previous year with the Royal Navy cruiser HMS Hawke, perhaps more badly than the company acknowledged.
All of a sudden they've shelled out all this money on a ship which is now useless. It's never going to pass another Board of Trade inspection.
And to make matters worse, they'd get no insurance payout. The Royal Navy had investigated the Hawke accident and found itself not guilty. Steamliners were a multi-million-dollar business. They catered not just for the rich and the famous, but also for the hundreds of thousands of migrants pouring across the Atlantic to America.
Olympic and Titanic are, in fact, the White Star Line's survival strategy in the very, very competitive North Atlantic trade. The company could well go into receivership. Something has to be done. These men are desperate.
The Titanic's ultimate owner was the American JP Morgan, one of the most ruthless financiers of the age. The head of White Star was Bruce Ismay, an equally shrewd operator.
They were businessmen, and they would make money by hook or by crook.
They knew they were in trouble. It may have been at this point that someone in the company came up with a bright idea.
Why not take the exact copy of the ship, sitting only 200 or 300 feet away? We have a lame duck. We have a boat that's no good. So we swap it over with the other boat.
Their only way out, really, was an insurance fraud. Otherwise, the ship they got was just a couple £100,000 worth of scrap iron.
Even today, the most common form of marine fraud is to swap the names of the ships. Goes on all the time. And in those days, it was no different.
By staging an accident, they could then claim the full insurance on the Olympic. And the Titanic, masquerading as the Olympic, could sail around the world for the next few decades, earning money for White Star.
Here is a perfect opportunity to make good on their losses, make good on the insurance, and develop this whole fraud that no one, they hope, is going to spot.
It was brilliant in its simplicity. But if White Star were going to get away with it, first they'd have to make sure these two ships really did look identical. Bruce Beveridge is a former Chicago cop, a Titanic enthusiast, and a skeptic about the switch theory. He spent years poring over plans and pictures of the two ships, applying his detective skills to the mystery.
The small differences between these two ships were minute, and you really had to have a sharp eye in order to pick them out.
Bruce looked at photos taken in the months before the disaster and was surprised by what he saw.
I found that when I started to compare the photographs of the two ships up until April 1st of 1912, that the Olympic surprisingly was starting to look more and more like Titanic.
About a luxury liner deemed the unsinkable that was going too fast in the North Atlantic and hit an iceberg, killing almost everybody on board. Anon News reports 14 years later this fictional book would play out in real life exactly down to the name, with the wreck of the Titanic, but this time it would have major political implications. Some of the wealthiest men in the world were on that ship, and some were opposed to the Federal Reserve and central banks. Let's go through some facts about the whole Titanic operation. JP Morgan funded and built the Titanic. JP Morgan was booked on the voyage but canceled at the last second. A friend of JP Morgan, Milton Hersey, also canceled at the last moment and survived to build the Hersey food empire. There were no red flares on board to signal any boats for rescue, only white flares that signal a party and that everything is okay. It was the first ship of its kind with the ability to seal decks electromagnetically, which could also seal people below the deck. The captain, Edward Smith, was one of the most decorated captains of his time and would have been totally out of character by avoiding precautions. The author of the book was poisoned to death a couple of years after the Titanic sank. The Federal Reserve was formed the very next year, and then the Astor family was one of the richest families in the world, and John Astor III opposed the Federal Reserve. John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man in the world at the time, a friend of Nikola Tesla, and an outspoken opponent of the creation of the Federal Reserve, Astor gained his wealth in part as a real estate builder, investor, and inventor. Other prominent Federal Reserve detractors such as Benjamin Guggenheim and Isa Strauss also died on board. Did J.P. Morgan get the idea of how to kill off the opposition to the Federal Reserve from a book written 14 years prior? This was a book below titled The Titan, published 14 years before the Titanic sank. And look at the similarities. Did they hatch a plan at Jekyll Island to build a ship to eliminate the competition? Similarities to the Titanic. Although the novel was written before the Olympic-class Titanic had ever been designed, there are some remarkable similarities between the fictional and real-life counterparts. Like the Titanic, the fictional ship sank in April in the North Atlantic, and there were not enough lifeboats for the passengers. There are also similarities between the size 800 feet long for the Titan versus 882 feet and 9 inches long for the Titanic, speed 25 knots for the Titan, 21 knots for the Titanic, and life-saving equipment. Beyond the name, the similarities between the Titanic and the fictional Titan include described as unsinkable. The Titanic was the world's largest luxury liner, 882 feet, displacing 63,000 long tons, and was once described as being practically unsinkable. The Titanic was the largest craft afloat and the greatest of the works of men, 800 feet, displacing 75,000 tons, and it was considered unsinkable. Shortage of lifeboats. The Titanic carried only 16 lifeboats, plus 4 Engelhard folding lifeboats, less than half the number required for the passenger's capacity of 3,000. The Titan carried as few as the law allowed, 24 lifeboats, less than half needed for her 3,000 capacity. Struck an iceberg. Moving too fast at 22.5 knots, the Titanic struck an iceberg on the starboard side on the night of April 14, 1912, in the North Atlantic, 400 miles away from Newfoundland. Also, on April night, in the North Atlantic, 400 miles from Newfoundland, Terra Nova, the Titan hit an iceberg while traveling at 25 knots, also on the starboard side. Sinking. The unsinkable Titanic sank, and more than half of her 2,200 passengers died. The indestructible Titan also sank, more than half of her 2,500 passengers drowning. Went down bow first. The Titan actually capsized before it sank. there really is a lot of similarities here. And there's no telling at times like this, the things people were able to get away with. There wasn't, satellites, and there wasn't people with smartphones, and there wasn't, too much anything for people to actually communicate to. These people were out in literally the middle of nowhere, out in the middle of the ocean. Anything could have happened to that ship, and all we know is the stories of the people that were supposedly survivors.